I still remember the first time my hand trembled while entering the transfer amount. It wasn't because it was too much. It was because my heart clenched a little. Every month, like clockwork, I'd send my son $1,200. No one asked me to. No one thanked me either. And somehow, that felt right. I thought, that's what mothers do. When your child is still stumbling their way through life, not yet steady on their feet, you be the pillow they lean on, even if your back aches, even if your own legs are giving out. I'm an old woman. I don't have much to show off. No travel photos. No fancy clothes. No birthday dinners. But every morning when I see the receipt for milk paid on time, or a picture of my grandson clutching his cereal box at breakfast, I feel something settle gently in my chest. What they don't know is, to make that money, I wake up at 4:30 a.m., wash my hands in cold water, make coffee for strangers at a tiny corner store downtown. Some days, I come home and my knees feel like they'll snap in half. But when I hear my grandson's laugh through the phone, somehow, I stand up straighter. I never told them. Not because I'm humble, but because I was afraid. Afraid that if I spoke, they'd think I was keeping score. That I wanted something in return. But I don't. I never have. I just thought if I skip a meal here, a grocery trip there, maybe my son can pay off another bill, maybe his wife won't stress so much, maybe their child can eat something warm for lunch at school. Being a mother, I've never been stingy. But perhaps, what I never imagined, was that someday, kindness could be returned like a maxed-out credit card. And it was just one night. One short video clip. But it cracked something in me that had been held together for years. And from that moment on, nothing was the same. Margaret never kept much for herself. A faded floral apron. A pair of walking shoes with soles wearing thin. A kitchen with creaking drawers and a fridge that hummed louder at night than she did during conversations. She didn't mind the silence. She'd gotten used to it since her husband passed away nearly a decade ago. The house still held echoes of him in the hallway, in the coffee mugs he liked, in the worn cushion of the recliner he never quite gave up. But life moved on. And so did bills. And children. And diapers. Every first Monday of the month, she'd sit at the small desk in the corner of her living room, log into her bank account, and transfer $1,200 to her son, always labeling it for the kids. As if money wired across states could wrap around a crying toddler or hold the weight of a woman still grieving her old life. They never asked her to send it. But they never said she shouldn't either. To Margaret, helping wasn't a decision, it was instinct. The kind of instinct that woke her before dawn each day, rain or snow, and carried her 2 blocks to the local corner store where she brewed coffee for strangers who never once asked why her hands shook. $10 an hour, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. Enough to cover the milk, the wipes, the little things. Enough to pretend she still mattered. She never told anyone she worked. What would they think? A 61-year-old woman wiping down counters, bent over behind a cash register, her name tag always slightly crooked. No. She told them she was doing fine, that she had more than enough, that it was just a little something to help. And every now and then, she'd slip a 20 into her grandson's tiny hoodie pocket when he wasn't looking. He was 4. Loved dinosaurs and grapes and anything blue. She once used her last 50 to buy him a little plastic T-Rex that roared when you pressed its back. When he smiled, it felt like breathing again. There were moments, though quiet, piercing ones, where her reflection caught her off guard. She'd see herself in the mirror above the sink. Graying roots, a sweater patched at the elbow, a mouth that had forgotten how to ask for anything. She'd stare and silently wonder, when did I start giving everything without expecting even a seat at the table? Margaret wasn't naive. She knew she wasn't part of their everyday lives. Not really. Phone calls were brief. Holidays were hectic. Her son always sounded tired. Her daughter-in-law always sounded polite. Still, she held on to hope like it was the last warm coat in a long winter. Maybe one day they'd visit more often. Maybe one day they'd say, "We couldn't have done it without you." Maybe one day she wouldn't feel so optional. But she never spoke it out loud. Not to them. Not even to Helen, her oldest friend, who dropped off baked goods every Sunday and always lingered a little longer than necessary. Because saying it naming the ache, made it real. And Margaret had learned long ago that some heartbreaks were easier to carry when you never unwrapped them. So she kept giving. And they kept taking. And each morning, as she tied her apron strings and watched the sun rise over the parking lot behind the store, she whispered to herself, "This is love. This is still love." Even as her fingers stiffened in the cold. Even as the snow crept into her shoes. Even as her heart, little by little, began to understand what her mouth never dared say. That maybe they loved the money, but not the hands that earned it. It was a Tuesday evening. The kind of evening where the sky slips into soft navy and the street outside hums with nothing but porch lights flickering on one by one. Margaret had just finished washing the dinner plate she ate from, alone, and sat down with a cup of weak tea and a habit she rarely admitted to anyone, scrolling through social media. She didn't do it often. Just enough to see a few pictures of her grandson at the zoo, a birthday cupcake from last week, the occasional reposted quote about family. Little windows into their lives. Windows she was never fully invited to walk through. Her thumb paused. She blinked. A video, barely 8 seconds long, began to play. The camera panned across a glossy black designer box, the unmistakable logo of Chanel stamped in gold. Jessica's hands, well manicured, jeweled, slowly untied the ribbon. Paper rustled softly. A sleek, polished handbag emerged, the kind that cost more than Margaret made in a month. Then came the caption. Mother-in-law came through right on time, face blowing a kiss, thanks for being so obedient. Margaret didn't breathe. She read it again. And again. Each word slapping harder than the last. Obedient. She wasn't sure what part broke her more. The thankless display, the smirking emoji, or that one word, sharp as a blade tucked between sarcasm and entitlement. Obedient. As if all her quiet sacrifices, her early mornings, her aching joints, were the reflex of someone too weak to say no. Not love. Not support. Obedience. For a moment, the screen blurred. Not from faulty pixels, but from tears she hadn't felt coming. She sat there, the mug cooling in her hand, the steam gone. Something inside her folded. Not snapped, not shattered, just quietly folded. Like a worn letter no one reads anymore. She had never asked for gratitude. Never wanted gifts or praise or applause. But this made her feel like a background character in a life she'd funded. Like a nameless donor thanked in fine print while others took the stage. Margaret had always believed love was expressed through action. Through doing. Through showing up. Through staying, even when uninvited. But that video, that caption, it told her something else. It whispered a truth she didn't want to hear. They didn't see her. Not really. They saw what she gave. They saw the deposits. The help. The bailouts. But not the woman behind them. Not the shaking hands at 5 a.m. Not the skipped lunch. Not the hours spent looking at baby shoes she couldn't afford, because all her money went into someone else's story. And now that story had a headline. And it wasn't "Thank you, Mom." It was "Thanks for knowing your place." Her chest hurt in a quiet, unfamiliar way, not sharp but deep. She set the phone down as if it had suddenly gained weight. She looked around her living room. The second-hand couch. The faded photo of her wedding day. The corner where her husband used to read the newspaper. All of it looked different now. Smaller. Emptier. Not because the room had changed, but because she had. Something inside her had tipped. Shifted. Caved in. And still, she said nothing. She didn't call her son. She didn't write a message. She didn't cry out or rage. She simply sat there in the dim light and let the silence fill her bones. Because sometimes, the most painful betrayals aren't loud. They come quietly, wrapped in ribbon, captioned with a smirk, posted for the world to like. That night, Margaret didn't sleep much. Not because she was angry, but because a question had begun echoing inside her, one she could no longer ignore. If they only value what I give, what am I when I stop giving? Later that same day, just a few hours after watching that video, the one with the bag, the ribbon, and the word obedient like a bruise she couldn't stop pressing, Margaret got a call. It was her son's number. But it wasn't his voice. It was Ellie, her granddaughter. The sweet, breathy kind of voice that still pronounced spaghetti with too many syllables. She was turning 6 in a few weeks. "Hi, Grandma," she said, her tone full of soft affection. Margaret's heart, the same one that had felt so sore just an hour before, instinctively softened. "Hi, my little bluebird," she replied, smiling even though no one could see it. They talked about the school hamster, about a lost crayon, about a wobbly tooth that hadn't come out yet. The usual things. The comforting, innocent things that still made the world feel whole. Then Ellie asked a question. Simple. Small. But it fell into Margaret's chest like a stone dropped in still water. "Grandma, how come I didn't get a birthday cake like Sophie did?" The silence that followed was so quiet, Margaret could hear the sound of her own breath change. A small intake. A health pause. She looked down at the old leather wallet beside her. It held exactly $12. She could count the bills without even opening it. $12. She'd spent most of the rest on groceries for herself, bulk oats, canned tuna, and a tiny jar of strawberry jam she hadn't bought in years but picked up on impulse that morning. Margaret closed her eyes. Not because she needed to think, but because she needed to brace herself for the feeling. Not guilt. Not shame. Just powerlessness. And that, to someone who had built her entire life on being the one who helped, felt like being cracked open. She took a deep breath and said softly, "Oh, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I didn't know Sophie's party was today." "It was yesterday," Ellie said. "She had a princess cake. It had lights on it. And all the girls got necklaces. Mommy said we didn't have time this year. But I told her you always send cake money." Margaret didn't know what to say. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Because how do you explain to a 6-year-old that her birthday was skipped so someone could post a handbag? That the 20 you tucked into her pocket last week was likely spent on delivery fees? That love, real, aching, sacrificial love, can be invisible when someone else holds the spotlight? "Grandma," Ellie's voice broke the silence again. Margaret steadied herself. "I'll make sure next year is special, baby," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. "I'll bake you the biggest cake in the whole world." Ellie giggled. "I want blueberry." "You got it." They ended the call soon after. Ellie's voice was full of sparkles again, as if the question had already drifted away like a balloon into the sky. But Margaret remained still, phone in hand, $12 in her wallet, and a heart now carrying a second crack, this one smaller, but somehow deeper. She walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Inside, half a loaf of bread, 2 eggs, and the small jar of jam. She looked at the jar for a long time. It had cost her $3.19. She didn't regret buying it, but she suddenly wished she hadn't. Not because she wanted the money back, but because she wanted the power back, the power to make her granddaughter feel seen, celebrated, worthy of balloons and sugar and candles shaped like stars. Instead, she felt small, like someone who had poured too much of herself into a cup that never stopped leaking. The house felt different now. Not colder, just quieter. As if the walls, too, were holding their breath with her. She sat down in her chair. The same chair she sat in every evening. And for the first time in years, she didn't reach for her book, or the remote, or her tea. She just sat. Still. Inside that moment. Inside that hollow place where love becomes question marks. And as she looked out the window into the night, she whispered a single sentence. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the room, the air, the moon if it was listening. "I thought I was doing the right thing." It was just after midnight. The kind of stillness where even the walls seem to be listening, and every breath you take feels louder than it should. Margaret sat at the edge of her bed, her nightgown slightly wrinkled, her feet bare against the wooden floor. The moonlight poured through the curtains like spilled milk, soft and quiet, as if afraid to disturb her. She hadn't cried. Not even once. Not after the video. Not after the question from Ellie. Not after sitting with the ache that had lived inside her for far longer than she wanted to admit. No, Margaret didn't cry. But she had changed. And when something inside you changes that quietly, that deeply, you don't announce it. You act. So she reached for the small drawer beside her bed, the one where she kept her checkbook, old letters, a pack of chewing gum, and a tiny notepad with passwords scribbled in her late husband's handwriting. She logged into her bank account. It took 3 tries, her fingers were shaking. The screen lit up with numbers she had memorized but rarely looked at all at once. $79,246.83. Everything she had left in this world. Years of saving, scrimping, skipping, sacrificing. All of it sitting in that cold digital balance. All of it poured into helping. All of it now a reminder of how little it had been seen. She stared at the screen for a long time. She thought of birthdays missed, apologies unsaid, the taste of bitter coffee on cold mornings, the tiny cramp in her back that never quite left. She thought of all the things she gave without receipt, and how none of it had kept her from becoming invisible. And then, without ceremony, without hesitation, she clicked, transfer all. But not to her son. No. To someone else. She picked up the phone and called Helen. Helen, her friend since they were 17. The only person left who still remembered what her laugh used to sound like before it got small. Helen had no children. No spouse. No distractions. But she had, always, a chair ready at her table, and silence that didn't demand explanations. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a groggy voice answered. Mags? Margaret didn't say hello. She didn't apologize for the hour. She simply said, I need your help. I want everything in your name by tomorrow morning. I'm done pretending they see me. There was a pause, heavy, but not confused. Helen had known, of course. She'd known for years. Okay, she said gently. Tell me what happened. Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. I don't think my own child understands what love is anymore. So I'm choosing someone who still knows what trust means. Helen didn't ask questions. Didn't try to fix it. She just listened. Like real friends do when you finally say the thing you've swallowed for years. Margaret continued, voice steady but low. I don't want them at my funeral asking what I left them. I want them to ask themselves why I didn't. The words hung there. Naked. True. Final. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse. She didn't even sound bitter. She just sounded tired. Tired in a way only women who have carried too much for too long can sound. Helen agreed to meet her at the bank first thing in the morning. They would change the paperwork. Reassign the title. Seal the vault of her lifetime's worth of giving. No ceremony. No tears. No goodbyes. Just action. Because that night, Margaret finally understood. Some love stories aren't about romance or family. Some love stories are about choosing yourself, after everyone else has forgotten to. And as she placed the phone down and pulled the blanket over her knees, Margaret whispered to no one. If love doesn't see me, then maybe trust will. She slept lightly that night. Not peacefully, but with clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the closest thing we get to grace. The bank smelled like stale paper and pine-scented floor cleaner. Too bright. Too cold. Margaret had never liked banks. Not because of what they were, but because of what they reminded her of, how easily a life's worth of work could be reduced to numbers on a screen, waiting to be handed over or taken away. She sat in the chair across from the notary, fingers folded neatly in her lap, the way she used to sit in church. Helen was beside her, silent, steady. Not saying much, but present in the way that truly mattered. On the desk lay 3 manila folders. Each one held a portion of Margaret's life. The deed to the small house she'd lived in since 1989. The title to a used Toyota Corolla with a dent in the rear bumper. The savings account, nearly $80,000, untouched except for what she gave away. Margaret didn't hesitate. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink as the pen touched the paper. One signature after another. Slow, deliberate. Like carving her name into stone. The woman across from her, wearing glasses too large for her face, paused after each document and looked up with a rehearsed smile. Are you sure, ma'am? She asked gently when Margaret moved to sign the last page. Margaret met her eyes. Clear. Calm. I'm more sure of this than anything I've done in a very long time. Helen placed a soft hand on Margaret's forearm, grounding her like roots in soil. The final paper was the will. A legal form, mostly boilerplate. Blank lines waiting to be filled with instructions, names, amounts. The usual choreography of inheritance. But Margaret didn't need paragraphs. She didn't need lawyers to explain fairness, or executors to balance what love had long left uneven. She pulled a single sheet of her own stationery from her purse, cream-colored, with a faint border of ivy. It had been sitting in her drawer for years, waiting for a moment she hoped would never come. With a pen that trembled slightly in her hand, she wrote one sentence. I leave behind love, but not a single dollar for those who saw me as an ATM. That was it. No lists. No breakdowns. No errors. Just a line, clean, sharp, unflinching. The notary looked at it, hesitated, then nodded. It's unconventional, she said, but legally valid. Margaret signed it with the same name she'd signed report cards, checks, and apology letters over the years. Only this time it was for herself. There was a kind of silence that followed. Not awkward. Not tense. Just full, like the end of a song that had taken too long to finish. Helen didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply folded the paper, slipped it into the envelope, and looked at Margaret with the kind of respect that words couldn't stretch to hold. On the way out, Margaret stopped briefly in the lobby. There was a family sitting across from her, a mother tapping on her phone, a teenage son staring at the ceiling, a little girl playing with the tassels of her winter hat. The mother's voice cut the air. If Grandma sends the money today, we'll pick it up tomorrow, okay? The boy groaned. The little girl giggled. Margaret didn't judge, but she did walk a little slower, breathing in the finality of her decision, letting it settle into her bones like winter air. That night, she placed the envelope in her dresser drawer. Beside it, she added one more thing. A photograph, not of her son or Jessica or even Ellie, but one of herself. At age 23, hair wild in the wind, eyes full of fight, smiling like the world hadn't yet taught her to be quiet. She looked at that version of herself and whispered, I finally did something just for us. She turned off the light, closed the drawer, and for the first time in years, Margaret slept through the night without waking once. Margaret died on a Thursday morning. The sky was gray, but not in the dramatic way novels like to describe, just flat and tired, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones without asking permission. She passed quietly in a small rented apartment on the south side of town, a place with peeling wallpaper, a weak heater, and a single chair by the window that caught the afternoon sun, when it was generous enough to show up. No family was there. Not her son. Not her daughter-in-law. Not even Ellie, who, last she heard, had started calling someone else Grandma when Jessica's mother moved in after her hip surgery. But Helen was there. She had arrived 2 nights earlier, carrying a grocery bag filled with Margaret's favorite things: chamomile tea, menthol rub, a faded crossword book with the corners already curled. When she saw Margaret lying in that narrow bed, cheeks hollowed by fever, voice almost gone, she didn't flinch. She sat beside her, took her hand, the one that had folded so many sandwiches, zipped so many coats, written so many checks, and she just stayed. No sermons. No reassurances. Just warmth. Margaret didn't say much in her final hours. The illness had taken her strength too quickly, but she did open her eyes once, in the middle of the night, and whisper something so soft that Helen had to lean in close to hear it. I don't regret it. 3 words. No explanations. No names. Just a final breath of peace, spoken like a woman who had, for the first time in her life, chosen herself, and had no intention of apologizing for it. Helen kissed her forehead and said, I know. When the nurse arrived in the morning and confirmed that she was gone, Helen didn't cry. Not right away. She made the calls. She signed the papers. She arranged for a simple cremation, just as Margaret had asked. No service, no flowers, no speeches. Let the silence speak for me, she'd once said with that dry smile of hers. It's the only thing they ever really gave me anyway. And in that silence, Helen stood alone, the last witness to a life that had given until it ached, and still found the grace to give more. There were no flood of condolences, no rushing of feet, no casseroles left on the porch. A few days later, a voicemail came from Jessica. We just heard. Sorry, we've been swamped. Let us know when we can come pick up the keys to the house and stuff. There's probably a lot to sort through. Helen listened to it once. Then she pressed delete. The apartment was already empty. The keys already turned in. And the things, The real things had already been passed on, far from the hands that only knew how to reach, never how to hold. That night, Helen opened the envelope Margaret had left her. Inside was a note written in that same delicate, precise handwriting, the kind that looked like it still belonged on stationery, not screens. If they ask what I left them, tell them this. I left quietly, just as I lived. And if they notice the silence, maybe that's what I always wanted. Helen placed the letter back in its envelope. She poured herself a cup of tea, the chamomile Margaret never got to finish, and sat in Margaret's old chair by the window. Outside, the sky was still gray. But there was a break in the clouds now, the faintest stroke of light pushing through. And in that light, Helen closed her eyes, letting the weight of her friend's life and the gentleness of her exit settle like dust on a quiet room. They arrived 15 minutes early. Jessica wore black, not out of grief, but presentation. A sleek dress, a designer bag tucked discreetly under her arm, and sunglasses she didn't take off, even inside the building. Her husband, Margaret's only son, looked more uncomfortable than sad. He shifted in his chair, tapping his foot with the kind of anxious energy that wasn't mourning, just impatience. There were no flowers, no photographs, no quiet reminiscing. They weren't here to remember her. They were here to collect what was left. The office was small, simple. A row of law books no one had opened in years lined the walls. A glass pitcher of lukewarm water sat on the side table beside a stack of paper cups. Helen sat across from them, silent. Her presence wasn't acknowledged. Jessica leaned toward her husband and whispered, not quite softly enough, "I bet she left the house to Ellie. Or maybe the car. I always hated that thing." He didn't respond. The lawyer entered. A middle-aged man with tired eyes and a careful voice. "Thank you for coming," he said. "We're here to fulfill the wishes of the late Margaret Lane." Jessica removed her sunglasses and gave a polite smile, the kind reserved for customer service interactions. "We were very close," she said. Helen didn't look at her. The lawyer opened a thick envelope, cleared his throat. Then he pulled out a single sheet of paper, one that was noticeably not from the office, but handwritten on cream stationery with a faint ivy border. He read, slowly, clearly, "I leave behind love, but not a single dollar for those who saw me as an ATM." That was it. He looked up. Silence. Not a ceremonial silence, but a stunned, aching kind of stillness that felt like a dropped plate no one had seen coming. Jessica blinked. Once. Twice. "What?" she asked, laughing slightly, waiting for the punchline. "That's it? That's the whole thing?" The lawyer nodded. "That's her legally binding final testament. It was verified, signed, and witnessed." "No. No, she said, standing up now, voice rising. "There must be a mistake. She had savings. She had a house. She gave us money every month. She wouldn't just cut us out." The lawyer remained calm. All property, accounts, and belongings were legally transferred prior to her death. The will is symbolic, but final. Jessica turned to her husband. "Say something. She was your mother." He didn't speak. His face had gone pale, not with sadness, but the dawning realization that everything he thought was owed to him had vanished like smoke. "She can't do this," Jessica hissed. "She can't just give it all away." "She didn't," Helen said softly, finally looking up. "She gave for years. You just never saw it." Jessica's face twisted, not in grief, but fury. "Who the hell even are you?" "I was the one holding her hand when she died." The silence returned, heavier this time. The lawyer gently began to gather the papers. "There's nothing more to discuss," he said. "There is no estate to divide. No inheritance to claim." Jessica stormed out first, her heels echoing too loudly in the quiet hallway. Her husband followed, a step slower, 1,000 thoughts chasing him, and not a single word to say. Helen remained. She watched the door close behind them. And then, slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out the last thing Margaret had written, not for lawyers, not for court, just for her. A note. "I hope they felt something, even if it was just the silence I left behind." Helen folded it gently and held it in her hands like a final breath. In the end, Margaret had spoken only once. And it was enough. The house felt colder than usual, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Helen had returned a few days after the reading. Not to gloat, not to celebrate, but because there were still things left to be done, things no one else cared enough to handle. There was a small box Margaret had left in her care, labeled in faint pencil, barely legible, for when they come asking. Inside was a single letter, folded neatly. Cream stationery. The same ivy border. The handwriting unsteady, but unmistakably Margaret's. Sharp where it needed to be, soft where it didn't dare to be otherwise. Helen sat in the quiet of her own kitchen now, hands resting over the envelope. She had debated whether or not to deliver it. Whether anything written inside would be read with the eyes of guilt or the shields of pride. But Margaret had asked her, not in desperation, but in trust. And so, 2 weeks after the will had been read, Helen returned to the home Margaret's son and daughter-in-law now occupied, the same one they hadn't set foot in while she was alive in that final year. Jessica answered the door. She didn't look surprised. Just tired. Or maybe disappointed. Like someone who opened a gift and found no glitter inside. "I'm not here to talk," Helen said quietly. "I'm just delivering something Margaret left." She handed her the envelope. Jessica took it. Looked down at it. Didn't say thank you. Helen turned and walked away, not expecting to be called back. Inside, Jessica stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. When she finally did, the paper made a sound, faint, dry, like something old being peeled back into the world. It began simply. "I once dreamed I was a tree. Not a grand one, not the kind carved into monuments. Just a tall, strong one. A tree that could give shade. Shelter. Something for children to sit beneath when the sun was too harsh, or when the rain came too fast. I wanted to be that kind of mother, rooted, steady, always there. And for a while, I believed I was. But the truth is, I became something else." Her handwriting wavered here, as if the weight of what came next had slowed her down. "I became a machine. Not of metal, but of habit. A provider on cue. A card that worked when swiped, a smile when it was convenient. An old woman turned automatic until the only thing you saw was the function I served. You didn't ask if I was warm in winter, or what I ate for dinner, or how my bones ached when I worked at dawn to send what was never enough. You only asked if the transfer went through." There was a pause in the ink, a line skipped, and then, "I don't hate you." That would mean I still expected more. I simply stopped pretending that love and usage were the same thing. And so I leave you this, a boundary. My final gift. A refusal. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Because maybe, just maybe, the absence of what you wanted will finally make room for the presence of what you never gave. Jessica read it through once. Then again. And for the first time in a long time she didn't speak. Not out loud. Not to herself. Not to her husband, who stood in the hallway, watching her with the same hollow stare he had worn since the reading. She folded the letter. Not in anger. Not even in guilt. But in a silence she didn't know what to do with. Later that night, she placed the letter in a drawer. Not the trash. Not the fireplace. Just a drawer. She didn't know why. Maybe it was because somewhere inside her, beneath the entitlement, the expectations, the easy comfort of never saying thank you, something had shifted. Something small. Not enough to undo what had been done, but enough to feel the weight of what had been lost. Have you ever gotten so used to someone showing up for you that you forgot they had a choice? So used to their yes that you stopped hearing the weight behind it. So used to being loved, you stopped asking how that love was being held up, or whether it was still alive beneath all the obligations. Sometimes love doesn't disappear in a storm. It erodes slowly, under 1,000 little silences, unspoken thanks, and expectations that no longer feel like requests. That's what happened to Margaret. But this story isn't just about money. It's about love, and its limits. About the kind of quiet giving that feels endless. Until one day it ends. And all that's left is a silence no one knows how to answer. We like to think love means never leaving. Always forgiving. Always providing. But what if love, real, enduring love, also needs protection? What if it needs boundaries? A final line drawn not in anger, but in self-respect? Margaret didn't leave with bitterness. She left with clarity. with one last act of choosing herself, in a life where she was always someone else's backup plan, never the priority. And maybe that's the question we're all left with. Who in your life is giving quietly, too quietly? And are you seeing them for who they are, or just for what they give? Maybe today's the day you ask yourself, have I thanked them? Have I listened, really listened when they didn't say I'm tired, but their eyes did? Or have I, without meaning to, mistaken their love for obligation? Because love can carry so much. But even love needs rest, needs recognition, sometimes even needs distance. And if you've ever been Margaret, if you've ever felt like a tree everyone leans on, but no one waters, I want you to know, you're not wrong for needing more. You're not selfish for closing a door that only ever swung one way. Sometimes saying no is the most honest version of I loved you. And if this story stirred something in you, a memory, a person, a silence that hasn't been spoken aloud, feel free to share it. You never know who might need to hear it. Maybe someone somewhere is still waiting to realize that the person they're leaning on is almost out of breath.